When Jonathan finds himself prisoned, a sort of wild feeling comes over him and he rushes up and down the stairs, trying every door and peering out of every window, but all in vain. Realizing that he is totally helpless, Jonathan sits quietly and begins to think over what could be done, but is not able to reach to any conclusion. He is certain about one thing, that there is no use of making his ideas known to Count, as Count himself has imprisoned Jonathan. He so decides to keep his fears and knowledge to himself and to keep his eyes open. Jonathan hears the great door below shut and knows that Count has entered. He returns to his room cautiously and finds Count making his bed, and after that, through the chink of the hinges of door, watches Count laying table for the supper, which confirms the fact that there is no one else in the castle apart from the Count and Jonathan himself. Jonathan now becomes aware of why the people on the coach feared for him, why the old lady had put rosary round his neck, and why all the passengers on the coach gave him crucifix, garlics, wild roses and mountain ashes as gift. After supper, as usual, Jonathan and Count Dracula talks on different matters related to the land to be purchased, with Jonathan never displaying his fear on his face. Count asks Jonathan if he had written any letter to Mr. Peter Hawkins. When Jonathan replies he did not have an opportunity to write, Count tells him to write a letter mentioning his stay extended to a month. Jonathan's heart grows cold with the thought, but since his employer Mr. Hawkins had sent him on his behalf, he could not refuse and bows to acceptance. Count sees his victory in Jonathan's bow and his mastery in the trouble of his face. He then warns Jonathan that he should sleep only in his room and nowhere else in the castle. Jonathan decides to write a formal letter to his employer Mr. Hawkins, indirectly notifying him of his displeasure in staying in Transylvania and whole of his experience to his fiancée Mina, who lives in England. He writes to Mina in shorthand so that Count could not make it. He gives the two letters to Count, which Count mixes with his own letters and leaves. When Jonathan goes to his room, he remembers Count's warning. He decides to disobey and moves to the room facing towards the south. From the window, when he looks outside, he suddenly sees Count's head coming out of the window in the lower story. His feelings changes to repulsion and terror when he watches the whole man slowly emerging from the window and crawling down the castle wall, facing down with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. He could hardly believe his eyes and feels the dread of the horrible place overpowering him. Count moves downwards in the sidelong way, some 100 feet down and a good deal to the left, and then vanishes into some hole or a window. Jonathan realizes that he is now alone in the castle and decides to utilize the opportunity to find a way out. He reaches the main door from where he had entered the castle but finds the massive door locked. He then explores all the rooms and finally reaches a room where he is encountered with 3 women vampires. They are about to hold him when suddenly comes Count Dracula and waves them away, just as the way the driver of the carriage had waved the wolves back. Shocked, Jonathan falls unconscious. When he wakes up, he is in his room. Count then asks Jonathan to write 3 letters, one saying that his work in Transylvania is nearly done and he shall start home within a few days. Another that he is starting on the next morning from the time of the letter, and the third that he has left the castle and arrived at Bistris. When Jonathan asks about the dates, Count mentions that the first letter should be dated June 12, the second June 19, and the third June 29th. Jonathan now knows the span of his life. He tries to write a letter to Mina but is caught. Jonathan finds all his belongings taken from his room. A thought suddenly waves in his mind that he had never seen Count in the daytime. He decides to check his room in the lower story. When he reaches the corridor of his floor, he finds it locked. He then decides to crawl the way Count does from the window. Believing God by his side, he manages to crawl through the window and enters Count's room and makes a search for the key. At the corner of the room lays a heavy door. He pushes it with all his efforts. When the door opens, it leads to a circular stairway which goes steeply down. As he descends down, at the bottom is a dark tunnel-like passage through which comes a deathly, sickly odor. As he goes down the passage, the smell gets closer. At last, he pulls a heavy door open and finds himself in a ruined chapel, evidently being used as a graveyard. There is nobody inside except around 50 old coffins, and in the largest among them lies Count Dracula. He is either dead or asleep. Afraid, Jonathan runs back to his room. He kneels down and weeps. Next day, Jonathan decides to descend down the window facing the south. Up till now, the story was the narration from Jonathan's journal. End of part 3.